Pro boxer laughs at obese woman, then her secret leaves him begging for forgiveness. In the days following his speech, Elliot began to notice just how much work lay ahead. The shift in his demeanor had not gone unnoticed, and while some of his colleagues cautiously acknowledged the change, others remained skeptical. He couldn't blame them. Words were easy, but trust? Trust had to be earned. His first test came during a marketing team meeting later that week. Jennifer, the head of marketing, was presenting a new campaign idea, her voice steady but tinged with a nervous edge. Elliot sat near the center of the room, taking in every detail of her presentation. In the past, he might have interrupted her by now, pointing out flaws or offering unsolicited advice to assert his dominance. But this time, he stayed quiet, listening intently. Jennifer paused, glancing at him briefly before continuing. She was visibly uncertain, likely expecting the usual barrage of interruptions or dismissive comments. Instead, Elliot waited until she finished speaking, letting her have the floor. When she finally concluded, she looked around the room, waiting for feedback. Elliot cleared his throat, the room falling silent as all eyes turned to him. "That was a strong presentation, Jennifer," he said, his voice calm and measured. "I especially liked your approach to targeting new demographics. It's creative and practical." Jennifer blinked, clearly taken aback. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "Do you have any suggestions for improvement?" Elliot nodded. "I think the visuals could be a bit more streamlined to match the tone of the campaign, but overall, it's a solid direction. I'm looking forward to seeing how it develops." The room was silent for a moment, the tension lingering like an unspoken question. Was this genuine? Was this a new Elliot, or just a temporary performance? Jennifer smiled faintly, her shoulders relaxing. "I'll work on that. Thank you for the feedback." As the meeting continued, Elliot noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. People seemed more willing to speak up, their voices steadier than before. He realized how much of an impact his previous behavior had on the team, not just the individuals he dismissed, but the entire culture of the office. Later that afternoon, Elliot approached Sarah at her desk. She was typing furiously, her brows furrowed in concentration. When she noticed him standing there, she flinched slightly, her hands hovering over the keyboard. "Hey," Elliot said, keeping his tone casual. "Got a minute?" Sarah hesitated, her gaze darting to the papers on her desk. Sure," she said, her voice uncertain. Elliot gestured toward an empty conference room nearby. "Can we talk in private?" "It's nothing bad, I promise." Sarah nodded slowly, following him into the room. She sat down across from him, her posture stiff as though bracing for criticism. "I wanted to thank you," Elliot began, his tone genuine, "for giving me a chance the other day. I know I've made things hard for you in the past, and I appreciate your patience." Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "I wasn't expecting an apology from you, to be honest," she admitted. "But it meant a lot." Elliot nodded, relief washing over him. "I'm glad to hear that. And I meant what I said. I want you to feel comfortable coming to me if you ever need to. No more shutting people down. I promise." Sarah smiled, a small but genuine gesture. "Thank you, Elliot. I think it's going to take some time, but I'm willing to try." They spoke for a few more minutes, the conversation light and amicable. When Sarah returned to her desk, she felt lighter than she had in months. Elliot, meanwhile, walked away with a sense of purpose. He had always thought leadership was about commanding authority, but now he realized it was about building trust. As the weeks went on, Elliot's efforts to change didn't go unnoticed. The atmosphere in the office began to shift, little by little. Meetings became more collaborative, with employees, especially women, feeling more comfortable sharing their ideas. Elliot made a conscious effort to listen, to hold back his instinct to dominate conversations, and to treat every contribution with respect. But not everyone was convinced. Vince, one of Elliot's peers in the finance department, was openly skeptical. "What's with the new act?" he asked one afternoon as they stood by the coffee machine. "Trying to win Employee of the Month or something?" Elliot glanced at him, unbothered by the jab. "No act," he said simply. "Just trying to do better." Vince snorted, taking a sip of his coffee. "Sure you are. Look man, You've been the same way for years. People don't just change overnight. I'm not expecting anyone to believe me right away, Elliot replied calmly. But I'm serious about this, Vince. I know I've screwed up, and I'm trying to make it right. Vince raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Good luck with that. People have long memories, you know. I know, Elliot said with a nod. And I'm not doing this to erase the past. I'm doing it to build a better future. Vince didn't respond, but the hint of respect in his eyes was undeniable. He walked away without another word, leaving Elliot standing there, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. One morning, about a month after the incident with James and his wife, Elliot received an email from her. The subject line was simple, a quick thank you. Elliot hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The email was short and to the point. I've heard about the changes you've been making, and I just wanted to say that I'm proud of the progress you've shown. It takes courage to admit your mistakes and even more to change. Keep it up, your team deserves the best version of you. Best regards, Sophie Morgan. Elliot stared at the screen, rereading the email several times. A strange mix of emotions swirled in his chest, gratitude, relief, and something he hadn't felt in a long time, pride. Not the arrogant, self-serving pride he used to thrive on, but the kind that came from knowing he was finally doing something right. He leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. It wasn't just Sophie's words that struck him, it was the realization that his efforts were making a difference. The tension in the office had lessened, and people seemed genuinely happier. For the first time in years, Elliot felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. A few weeks later, the company held its quarterly meeting, an event where employees from all departments gathered to discuss progress, challenges, and goals for the future. James Morgan stood at the front of the room, his commanding presence captivating the audience as he delivered his opening remarks. And now, James said with a smile, I'd like to hand things over to someone who has shown remarkable growth and leadership in the past few months. Elliot Grayson, would you please join me up here? Elliot froze, his heart racing as a wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Slowly, he stood, his legs feeling like jelly as he made his way to the front. He glanced at James, who gave him an encouraging nod. Elliot has been with us for years, James said, addressing the audience. And while he's always been a skilled professional, I've had the privilege of watching him grow into something even more important. A leader who listens, learns, and inspires those around him. Elliot's chest tightened as the audience erupted into applause. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Sarah, Jennifer, and even Vince, who clapped along with the others. Their expressions were genuine, their support undeniable. When the applause died down, Elliot stepped up to the microphone, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he began to speak. I'm honored to stand here today, he said. But I want to be clear, this isn't about me. It's about all of you. You've given me the chance to learn, to grow, and to become the kind of leader I should have been all along. For that, I'm deeply grateful. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. I know I've made mistakes, and I know I still have a lot to prove. But I promise you this, I'll keep striving to do better, not just for myself, but for all of us. Because when we lift each other up, we all succeed. The room erupted into applause once more, and Elliot stepped back, his heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and pride. As he returned to his seat, James patted him on the back, a smile of approval on his face. For the first time, Elliot felt like he truly belonged. And as he looked around at his colleagues, his team, his family, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Elliot walked out of the quarterly meeting with his colleagues, the sound of applause still ringing faintly in his ears. The moment had been surreal, and he still struggled to fully process the warmth and encouragement he'd received. For years, he had commanded attention through arrogance and intimidation, but this time, the applause had been earned through humility and effort. It felt different, better. Hey, Elliot, a voice called, snapping him out of his thoughts. He turned to see Jennifer approaching him, her expression a mix of amusement and approval. That was a nice speech, she said, stopping a few feet away. A little surprising, but nice. Elliot smiled, his hands stuffed awkwardly into his pockets. Thanks. I wasn't sure how it would go over. Jennifer crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. Well, you didn't collapse under pressure, so I'd call that a win. Her teasing tone made Elliot chuckle, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a genuine sense of camaraderie. It was a reminder that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned. Honestly, Jennifer continued, her tone softening, it's been nice seeing this side of you. I wasn't sure if it was real at first, but I think it is. It is, Elliot said, his voice firm. And I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out. I've been pretty unbearable, haven't I? Jennifer smirked. Let's just say you've kept us on our toes. Elliot laughed, the tension in his chest easing. Fair enough. But I'm glad things are changing. And I mean it. If you ever see me slipping back into old habits, don't hold back. Call me out. Jennifer nodded, her expression softening further. I will. But for what it's worth, I think you're on the right track. As she walked away, Elliot felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't just the words, though they meant a lot. It was the trust behind them. Bit by bit, he was rebuilding the bridges he had burned, and it gave him the motivation to keep going. Later that week, Elliot found himself sitting in his office, staring at an email draft he'd been working on for the better part of an hour. It was addressed to Sophie Morgan, James's wife, the woman who had unknowingly set him on this path of transformation. The words didn't come easily, but he knew he needed to write them. Finally, after a deep breath, he began to type. Dear Sophie, I hope this email finds you well. I've been thinking a lot about what happened during our first meeting and the things you said to me. At the time, I didn't want to hear them. I was too caught up in my own ego to recognize the truth you were trying to show me. But over the past few weeks, I've been working hard to change, not just for the sake of my colleagues, but for myself. I've realized how much damage my behavior has caused, and I'm committed to doing better. I know I still have a long way to go, but I wanted to thank you for being the one to open my eyes. Without that wake-up call, I don't think I'd be where I am today. I hope I can continue to learn and grow, and I'm grateful for the chance to prove that I can be better. Thank you for your patience, your wisdom, and your willingness to hold me accountable. Best regards, Elliot Grayson. Elliot stared at the screen, reading the words over and over again. They felt honest, raw, and unpolished, just as they should be. With a decisive click, he sent the email, leaning back in his chair as a sense of relief settled over him. It wasn't much, but it was a step. The following Monday, Elliot was in the break room pouring himself a cup of coffee when Sarah walked in. She hesitated for a moment, clearly debating whether or not to approach him, before finally stepping forward. Morning, she said, her voice soft but steady. Morning, Elliot replied with a smile. How's it going? Good, Sarah said, shifting her weight nervously. Actually, I wanted to thank you for what you said in the quarterly meeting. It meant a lot. Elliot set his coffee down, turning to face her fully. I'm glad, he said, but I should be thanking you. You've put up with a lot from me, and I'm grateful you're still willing to give me a chance. Sarah smiled faintly, a flicker of relief crossing her face. You're different now, she said. It's like you're really listening. It's refreshing. Elliot nodded, his chest tightening with gratitude. I'm trying. And if there's ever anything I can do to make things easier for you, or anyone else, please let me know. Sarah nodded, her smile growing. Thanks, Elliot. I appreciate that. As she walked away, Elliot couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. Change wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but moments like this made it feel worthwhile. Months passed, and the changes in Elliot's behavior became more evident with each passing day. His colleagues began to trust him more, their hesitancy giving way to collaboration and mutual respect. Meetings were no longer dominated by his voice. Instead, they became opportunities for open dialogue and shared ideas. Even Vince, who had remained skeptical for weeks, eventually warmed up to him. You're really sticking with this, huh? He said one afternoon as they worked on a joint project. Yeah, Elliot replied with a small smile. Turns out it feels a lot better to lift people up than to push them down. Vince chuckled, shaking his head. Who would have thought? The great Elliot Grayson, team player. Elliot laughed, the sound light and genuine. Stranger things have happened. As the office culture continued to evolve, Elliot found himself not only respected but liked, a feeling he hadn't realized he was missing until now. For years, he had equated authority with isolation, believing that respect could only be earned through fear. But now, he saw the value of connection, of empathy, of building others up. One evening, as Elliot was packing up his things to leave, he received a reply to the email he had sent Sophie weeks earlier. He opened it, his heart pounding as he read her response. "Dear Elliot, thank you for your email. It takes a great deal of courage to admit when you've been wrong, and an even greater deal to commit to change. I've heard from James about the progress you've been making, and I want you to know how proud I am of the effort you've put in. Change is never easy, but it's always worth it. Keep pushing forward, even when it feels difficult. The respect and trust of your colleagues are invaluable, and from what I've seen, you're well on your way to earning both. Best of luck. Sophie Morgan." Elliot closed the email, a wave of emotion washing over him. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was finally on the right path, not just for his career, but for the person he wanted to become. As he left the office that night, the city lights casting a warm glow on the streets, Elliot felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he never would be, but for the first time, he was okay with that. Because perfection wasn't the goal. Growth was. And he was just getting started. The office had changed significantly in the months since Elliot began his transformation. While his initial efforts had been met with skepticism, the changes he made were undeniable. Meetings ran smoother, collaboration flourished, and there was a sense of mutual respect that had been missing for years. It wasn't just Elliot who had grown, it was the entire team. His willingness to change had opened the door for others to reflect on their own behaviors, and slowly, the culture of the office shifted. Elliot sat at his desk late one afternoon, reviewing reports for an upcoming presentation. His focus was broken by a soft knock at the door. When he looked up, he saw Sarah standing there, holding a folder. "Hey," she said, stepping inside cautiously. "Do you have a minute?" Elliot nodded, setting the papers aside. "Of course. What's up?" Sarah walked over to his desk and handed him the folder. "I've been working on this campaign idea," she said. "I was hoping to get your thoughts before I present it to the team." Elliot opened the folder, scanning the pages inside. The proposal was detailed, creative, and well-organized. He glanced up at Sarah, who was fidgeting nervously. "This is really good," he said after a moment. "I especially like how you've tied in the customer feedback. It shows you're paying attention to the details." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, a mix of surprise and relief washing over her. "Really? You think so?" "I do," Elliot said, nodding. "It's clear you've put a lot of thought into this. The only thing I'd suggest is maybe expanding on the budget section a bit, give the team a clearer picture of the costs and potential ROI." Sarah smiled, her posture relaxing. "Thanks, Elliot. I'll work on that." "You're doing great, Sarah," he added, his tone sincere. "Don't let anyone, including me, make you feel like you don't belong here. You've got real talent." Her smile widened, and for a moment, Elliot saw a glimmer of the confidence he knew she deserved to feel every day. "Thanks," she said softly. "That means a lot." As she left the office, Elliot leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at his lips. Moments like that reminded him of why he had committed to changing in the first place. It wasn't about saving face or earning praise, it was about making sure the people around him felt valued. A few weeks later, the company hosted its annual retreat, a 2-day event designed to foster teamwork and creativity. Employees gathered at a scenic lakeside resort, the crisp autumn air invigorating as they participated in workshops, team-building exercises, and brainstorming sessions. Elliot had been looking forward to the retreat, though he wasn't sure how his colleagues would interact with him outside the office. Would the progress he'd made carry over into a more casual setting? Or would the lingering memories of his past behavior cast a shadow over the weekend? The first evening, after a long day of activities, the team gathered around a campfire by the lake. The flames crackled softly, casting a warm glow on the group as they chatted and laughed. Elliot sat on the edge of the circle, quietly observing. He was content to listen, letting others take the spotlight. "Hey, Elliot," Vince called from across the fire, his voice breaking through the hum of conversation. "Why so quiet? This is the perfect time for one of your infamous speeches." The group chuckled, though the tone was lighthearted. Elliot smiled, shaking his head. "I think I've done enough talking for one lifetime." "Come on," Vince pressed, a grin on his face. "Tell us something we don't know about you." Elliot hesitated, caught off guard. It wasn't often that he talked about himself outside of work. For years, he had built walls around his personal life, keeping everyone at arm's length. But now, as he looked around the circle, he realized that these weren't just colleagues. They were people who had given him a second chance. Maybe it was time to let them in. "Well," he began, his voice steady, "most people don't know this, but I actually wanted to be a teacher when I was younger." A murmur of surprise rippled through the group. "A teacher?" Jennifer asked, raising an eyebrow. "I can't picture that." Elliot chuckled. "Yeah, neither can I anymore. But back then it was all I wanted. I thought it'd be amazing to help people learn and grow, to make a difference in their lives." "So what happened?" Sarah asked, her curiosity genuine. Elliot's smile faded slightly and he shrugged. "Life happened, I guess. Somewhere along the way, I got caught up in the idea of success. I wanted to prove I could climb the ladder, be the best at whatever I did. And I guess I lost sight of what really mattered." The group fell quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. Elliot glanced around the circle, suddenly feeling vulnerable. But instead of judgment, he saw understanding in their faces. "Sounds like you're finding your way back to that," Sarah said softly. "Helping people grow, I mean." Elliot looked at her, surprised by the observation. He hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. In a way, his role as a leader had become less about authority and more about mentorship, a small echo of the dream he'd once had. "Maybe," he said with a small smile. "I hope so." The conversation shifted after that, moving on to lighter topics. But as the evening went on, Elliot felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged, not because of his title or accomplishments, but because of who he was becoming. The next day, during a workshop on collaboration, Elliot was paired with Sarah, Jennifer, and Vince for a team exercise. The goal was to build a bridge out of limited materials, a challenge that required creativity and communication. "Okay," Jennifer said, taking charge. "We need to figure out how to make this stable with what we've got." "Let's start with the base," Sarah suggested. "If we use the popsicle sticks to form a triangle, it should distribute the weight better." "That's a good idea," Elliot said, nodding. "And we can use the string to reinforce it, tie it around the corners to keep everything secure." Vince smirked. "Look at you, Mr. Team Player. Who are you, and what have you done with Elliot?" Elliot laughed, the teasing no longer stinging the way it once might have. "Just trying not to ruin the bridge, or the team." The group worked together seamlessly, each person contributing ideas and refining the plan. When their bridge was finished, it was one of the sturdiest in the room, earning them a round of applause from the facilitator. As they sat back down, Jennifer glanced at Elliot, a faint smile on her face. "You know, you're not so bad when you're not trying to take over the world." "High praise," Elliot said with a grin. "Thanks, Jennifer." The retreat ended on a high note, with the team feeling more connected than ever. For Elliot, it was a turning point, not just in his career, but in his life. He had spent so long chasing success, believing it was measured by titles and achievements. But now, he understood that true success was about the relationships you built, the people you lifted up, and the difference you made. Back at the office, the changes continued to ripple outward. Elliot became a mentor to younger employees, offering guidance and support without the arrogance that had once defined him. He collaborated more with his peers, valuing their insights and perspectives. And while he still had moments of doubt and missteps, he always made an effort to course correct, to learn, and to grow. One afternoon, as he was wrapping up a meeting, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Sophie Morgan. "I hear the retreat was a success. James mentioned your bridge-building skills. Sounds like you've found your calling. Keep up the good work." Elliot smiled, her words a reminder of how far he'd come. He replied with a simple message. "Thanks, Sophie. I'm just getting started." And he meant it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Elliot was excited for the journey. Not as a boss or a leader or a man trying to prove his worth, but as someone who finally understood what it meant to truly connect, to listen, and to grow. Months passed, and the transformations in the office continued to deepen. Elliot had found a rhythm that balanced his responsibilities as a leader with his growing commitment to fostering a healthier workplace culture. He wasn't perfect, old habits occasionally surfaced, but each time they did, he caught himself and course-corrected. The man who had once been known for arrogance and dismissiveness was now seen as someone approachable, supportive, and, dare they say it, a mentor. One Friday afternoon, Elliot called for an all-hands meeting, gathering the entire team in the large conference room. The atmosphere was light but curious. These meetings had become less frequent since Elliot's shift in leadership style. Now, when he called them, people knew there was a reason, and it wasn't just about him. As the team settled in, Elliot stood at the head of the table, hands resting on the back of a chair. He took a moment to look at the people in the room: Sarah, Jennifer, Vince, and so many others who had, in their own ways, shaped his journey. He cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "First, I want to thank all of you," he began, his voice steady but heartfelt. "The past few months have been a learning experience for me, and I wouldn't have made it this far without your patience and support." The room was silent, the sincerity in his tone commanding their full attention. "I called this meeting because I think it's time we talk about where we're headed, not just as a team, but as a company," Elliot continued. "We've made a lot of progress recently, but there's always room for improvement. I want to hear from you, what's working, what's not, and how we can continue to grow together." He gestured toward the whiteboard at the front of the room, where he had written the words growth and goals. "This isn't just my meeting," he said. "It's ours. So let's start with what we've done well. Who wants to go first?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sarah raised her hand, her voice steady and clear. "I think one of the biggest changes has been the way we collaborate," she said. "There's more respect, more listening, and it's made a huge difference in how comfortable people feel sharing ideas." Elliot nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "That's great to hear. Anyone else?" Jennifer leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "I'd say accountability has improved," she said. "Not just in the sense of holding others accountable, but holding ourselves accountable. It's created a sense of trust that wasn't always there before." Vince chuckled, crossing his arms. "I'll admit, I was skeptical about all this at first," he said. "But I've seen the change. People are happier, more engaged. It feels like we're finally working as a team." The room murmured in agreement, and Elliot felt a swell of pride. These weren't just surface-level comments. They were reflections of genuine progress. He had spent so long focused on his own ambitions that he had never realized the power of collective growth. "Thank you for sharing," he said, his tone warm. "Now let's talk about what we can improve. Be honest, I can take it." There was a ripple of laughter, and the tension eased. One by one, team members shared their thoughts, highlighting areas where the company could do better. Elliot took notes, asking questions and encouraging dialogue. By the end of the meeting, the whiteboard was covered with ideas, and the energy in the room was palpable. As the team filed out, Sarah lingered behind, approaching Elliot with a thoughtful expression. "That was a great meeting," she said. "It's nice to see how much things have changed." "Thanks, Sarah," Elliot replied. "But I couldn't have done it without all of you." She smiled, then hesitated. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but I actually look forward to these meetings now." Elliot chuckled, the compliment warming him. "That might be the highest praise I've ever gotten." She laughed softly, then gave him a nod before heading back to her desk. Elliot watched her go, a sense of fulfillment settling over him. For years, he had measured success by numbers and accolades, but now he understood that true success was about the people you impacted along the way. That evening, as Elliot packed up his things, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from James Morgan, the CEO, and Sophie's husband. "Heard great things about your meeting today. Sophie's been keeping me updated on your progress. Proud of you, Elliot. Keep it up." Elliot stared at the message, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief washing over him. He hadn't sought validation from James or Sophie, but their support meant more than he could put into words. He replied with a simple message. "Thanks, James. It's been a journey, but I'm all in." As he left the office, the city lights casting a golden glow on the streets, Elliot thought about how far he had come. He wasn't the same man who had dismissed and belittled others, who had mistaken arrogance for strength. He was someone better, someone still growing, still learning, but determined to make every step count. The following week, Elliot attended a company-wide leadership seminar, an event aimed at fostering growth among managers and department heads. The keynote speaker was none other than Sophie Morgan. Elliot hadn't known she would be there, and when she stepped onto the stage, he felt a pang of nervousness. Sophie spoke with grace and authority, her words resonating with the audience as she shared insights on leadership, empathy, and the power of listening. As she concluded her speech, she glanced in Elliot's direction, her eyes twinkling with a hint of amusement. After the seminar, Elliot approached her, unsure of what to say. Sophie greeted him with a warm smile. "Elliot," she said, her tone light. "It's good to see you." "You too," he replied. "Your speech was incredible. I think the entire room was hanging on your every word." "Thank you," she said. "And how are things going for you? Still holding yourself accountable?" "Every day," Elliot said with a nod. "It's not always easy, but it's worth it. The team has been amazing, and I'm learning so much from them." Sophie's smile widened. "That's good to hear. I knew you had it in you. You just needed a little push." Elliot chuckled, the memory of their first meeting flashing in his mind. "More like a shove," he said, his tone light. "But I'm glad it happened. I don't think I would have changed otherwise." Sophie's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "What matters is that you did change," she said. "And from what I've heard, you've made a real difference, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. That's something to be proud of." Elliot nodded, her words sinking in. For so long, he had chased external validation, but now he understood that true pride came from within, from knowing you had done the right thing even when it was hard. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." Sophie smiled one last time before turning to greet another attendee, leaving Elliot standing there with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't perfect, and he never would be, but for the first time, he was okay with that. Because growth wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, and Elliot was determined to keep moving forward. As Elliot returned to the office the next day, he was greeted by Sarah, Jennifer, and Vince, who were gathered near the break room. They waved him over, their smiles genuine. "Hey, Elliot," Vince said, his tone teasing. "Think you can handle a little coffee break brainstorming? We've got some big ideas for the next campaign." Elliot grinned, grabbing a mug and joining them at the table. "Let's hear it," he said, leaning in. The conversation flowed effortlessly, filled with laughter, ideas, and mutual respect. And as Elliot sat there, surrounded by his team, he realized he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not just success, but connection, purpose, and the knowledge that he was making a difference. It wasn't the end of his journey, it was just the beginning. As the weeks rolled on, Elliot found himself settling into a new rhythm. The transformations he had worked so hard to achieve were no longer conscious efforts but second nature. Listening to others, fostering collaboration, and showing humility had become part of who he was. The team noticed, and the once tense office environment had been replaced with a sense of camaraderie that Elliot couldn't have imagined a year ago. One afternoon, as Elliot walked through the open office, he overheard a conversation between two interns at the coffee machine. They were speaking quietly, but he caught enough of their words to understand they were discussing him. "It's crazy, right?" one of them said. "I heard he used to be impossible to work with. Like, people dreaded meetings with him." "Yeah, I heard that too," the other replied. "But honestly, he's been nothing but supportive since I started. He even helped me prep for that pitch last week." "Same," the first intern said. "Maybe people can actually change." Elliot paused, a small smile tugging at his lips. He didn't interrupt their conversation, instead continuing toward his office. Their words stayed with him, though, not because they praised him, but because they reminded him of how far he had come. Change was possible, but it required effort, vulnerability, and a willingness to face the uncomfortable truth about yourself. Later that week, Elliot attended a quarterly leadership review with James Morgan and the other department heads. The meeting was formal but focused, with each leader presenting updates on their team's progress and challenges. When it was Elliot's turn, he stood confidently, a stack of notes in hand. "Before I dive into the numbers," Elliot began, his voice calm and measured, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge my team. The growth we've seen over the past quarter isn't just because of me, it's because of them. Their ideas, their collaboration, and their commitment to excellence have been the driving force behind everything we've achieved." James raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's a shift in tone from previous reviews, Elliot," he said. "Care to elaborate?" Elliot nodded, setting his notes down. "It's no secret that I used to approach leadership as a one-man show," he admitted. "I thought being a leader meant having all the answers, making all the decisions, and asserting control. But I've realized that real leadership is about empowering others. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued and heard." He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of his fellow department heads. "When I started changing the way I led, I saw something incredible happen. My team didn't just perform better, they thrived. They came up with ideas I never would have thought of. They supported each other in ways I hadn't expected. And I realized that by stepping back, I was actually making space for something much greater." The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of Elliot's words sinking in. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a powerful realization," he said. "And I think it's one we can all learn from." As Elliot sat down, he felt a sense of accomplishment, not because he had impressed James or his peers, but because he had spoken from the heart. For the first time, he felt like he was truly leading with integrity. A few days later, Elliot received an unexpected email from Sophie Morgan. It was brief but carried a warmth that made him smile. "But I wanted to let you know how proud I am of the progress you've made. James has shared some of your recent accomplishments with me, and it's clear you're not just leading, you're inspiring. Keep going. The best is yet to come." Sophie. Elliot replied with a simple thank you, but the message stayed with him. Sophie's belief in him had been a catalyst for change, and her continued encouragement reminded him that growth was a lifelong journey. One morning, Sarah knocked on Elliot's office door, a folder clutched in her hands. "Got a minute?" she asked, stepping inside when he waved her in. "Always," Elliot said, setting his work aside. "What's on your mind?" Sarah sat down, her expression a mix of excitement and nerves. "I wanted to share something with you," she said, handing him the folder. "It's a proposal I've been working on for a while. I think it could really help us expand into new markets." Elliot opened the folder, scanning the pages. The proposal was thorough, innovative, and clearly the result of hours of hard work. He glanced up at Sarah, who was watching him anxiously. "This is fantastic," he said after a moment. "You've really thought this through?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "You think so?" "I do," Elliot said firmly. "In fact, I think you should present this at the next leadership meeting." Her excitement faltered, replaced by uncertainty. "Me?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "You are," Elliot said. "You've put in the work, and you deserve the credit. I'll be there to support you, but this is your moment." Sarah hesitated, but then she nodded, a determined look in her eyes. She said, "I'll do it." When the day of the meeting arrived, Sarah stood at the front of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she began her presentation. Elliot sat near the back, offering her an encouraging nod. As she spoke, her confidence grew, her passion for the project shining through. By the end of her presentation, the room erupted in applause, and James himself commended her for her vision. Elliot felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for Sarah. Moments like this were why he had changed. Seeing others succeed, knowing he had played a small part in their growth, was more rewarding than any personal accolade. The following weekend, the company hosted a charity event, inviting employees and their families to participate. Elliot attended, mingling with colleagues and their loved ones. He noticed Sarah chatting animatedly with Jennifer and Vince near the refreshments table, her confidence shining brighter than ever. As the evening progressed, Elliot found himself standing near James and Sophie Morgan. Sophie smiled warmly as he approached. "Elliot," she said, her tone light. "Enjoying the event?" "Very much," he replied. "It's great to see everyone outside of work." James nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "I've been hearing nothing but good things about you lately," he said. "It seems like you've really turned things around." Elliot smiled, a hint of humility in his expression. "I've had a lot of help along the way," he said, glancing at Sophie. "And a few important wake-up calls." Sophie laughed softly. "Sometimes that's all it takes," she said. "The willingness to listen and grow." As the conversation continued, Elliot felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known before. The man he had been, the one consumed by arrogance and self-importance, felt like a distant memory. In his place was someone who valued connection, collaboration, and the power of lifting others up. The next Monday morning, Elliot arrived at the office early, a cup of coffee in hand as he prepared for the week ahead. He glanced around the quiet space, reflecting on how much had changed. The office, once filled with tension and unease, now buzzed with energy and purpose. Elliot sat at his desk, pulling out a notepad. At the top of the page, he wrote a simple phrase: "What's next?" It wasn't a question of doubt or uncertainty, it was one of possibility. For the first time, Elliot wasn't focused on climbing the ladder or proving himself. He was focused on the journey, on the people he worked with, and on the impact he could make. And he was ready for whatever came next. With that, Elliot's story reached a new chapter, not an ending, but a continuation of his growth and the relationships he had built. Change wasn't a destination, it was a process. And Elliot was committed to seeing it through, one step at a time. As the months went by, Elliot's leadership continued to evolve. He wasn't just making strides in his own career, he was helping to shape the culture of the company in ways he never imagined possible. His team had flourished under his guidance, and he now felt more fulfilled than ever. It was early morning when Elliot received a call from his assistant. "Elliot, the CEO's office just called. James wants to meet with you later this afternoon. It's important," he says. The words sent a slight ripple of unease through Elliot's chest. Meetings with James were rarely casual, and the tone in his voice hadn't been light. Still, he nodded to himself, reminding himself of the progress he'd made. "Thanks, I'll be there." Later that afternoon, Elliot stood in front of James's office, his mind racing. 100 scenarios ran through his head, all of them revolving around the possible reasons for this sudden meeting. Had something gone wrong? Was his transformation still a work in progress? What could James need from him now? With a deep breath, he knocked and entered. James was sitting behind his desk, his expression thoughtful as he looked over some papers. "Elliot," James said, smiling as he looked up. "Please, take a seat." Elliot sat down, trying to calm the nervous flutter in his stomach. James's tone was warm, but the weight of the situation still lingered. "What's going on, James?" Elliot asked, keeping his voice steady. "You sounded serious on the phone." James raised an eyebrow but smiled again. "It's not bad news, I promise. Actually, it's quite the opposite." Elliot relaxed slightly, leaning forward. "Then why all the secrecy?" James leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing with appreciation. "Well, the truth is I've been noticing some real changes, not just in the way you're leading your team, but in the overall shift in our company culture. You've been steering the ship in a new direction, and it's paying off." Elliot blinked in surprise. "I didn't expect you to say that." James chuckled. "I know. I don't always show it, but I've been watching. And I've been impressed by how you've handled yourself, especially in the last few months." Elliot shifted in his seat, the tension slowly dissipating. "Thank you, James. That means a lot." James leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "Which is why I want to offer you something, a new role within the company. We've been talking a lot about long-term vision, about leadership in this company, and you've demonstrated everything we're looking for." Elliot's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of role are you talking about?" "A promotion of sorts," James replied, his eyes serious but filled with respect. "I want you to take over as head of operations for the entire company. It's a big step, and it won't be easy, but I believe you're ready for it." For a moment, Elliot didn't know how to respond. His mind raced, unsure whether he'd heard James correctly. Head of operations? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you sure about this? James nodded firmly. Absolutely. I've seen the way you've transformed, and I'm confident that you're the right person for this. You've already demonstrated your ability to empower others, lead by example, and build trust. And that's exactly what this role demands. Elliot sat back in his chair, his mind a whirlwind. This was everything he had wanted, everything he had worked toward since the day he had started changing his behavior. But it also came with immense responsibility. The weight of the decision began to settle on his shoulders. I'll need some time to think about it, Elliot said, his voice quieter than usual. This is a huge change, and I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing, not just for me but for the team. James nodded understandingly. Of course, take all the time you need, but know that the offer is on the table. And when you're ready, we'll discuss the next steps. Elliot stood up, his mind still spinning. Thank you, James. I'll let you know soon. As he walked out of James's office, his heart raced. This was everything he had hoped for, but it felt like a turning point, a crossroads where he would have to leave behind the old Elliot for good. The pressure mounted as he thought about what this new role would mean not just for his career, but for the people he had worked so hard to empower. Later that evening, Elliot sat at his kitchen table, the stillness of the apartment giving him the space to think. His phone sat beside him, messages from his colleagues unread, as he stared at the glass of water in front of him. The decision felt monumental. Could he handle this new responsibility? Was he ready to take on a role that would demand so much from him? He thought back to the first meeting he had ever had with Sophie, when he had dismissed her without a second thought. He had been so consumed with his own ideas, his own ego, that he hadn't even seen the potential for change that lay right in front of him. But now, as he looked at his life and the relationships he had built, he realized how far he had come. And perhaps, just perhaps, this role would be the next step in the journey. A journey that had already proven to be so much more than he could have imagined. Taking a deep breath, Elliot grabbed his phone and sent a quick message to James. James, I've thought about it and I'm ready. I want to take on the head of operations role. His finger hovered over the send button for a moment before he pressed it, his heart pounding in his chest. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid. He felt ready. The next day, Elliot walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of the promotion still hung in the air, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was invigorating. As he sat at his desk, he reflected on the journey he had taken. He had gone from being a man defined by arrogance and control to someone who now understood the true power of humility and collaboration. As the morning wore on, Sarah stopped by his desk. "Elliot," she said, her voice quiet but with a hint of excitement, "I heard the news." Elliot smiled, his gaze softening as he looked up at her. "Yeah, it's official now. I'm taking over as head of operations." "That's amazing," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. "You've earned it." Elliot shrugged slightly, a modest smile on his face. "It's not just about me. We've built something together, and this new role is just another way to keep growing." Sarah nodded, her voice sincere. "I'm really happy for you, Elliot. I know you'll do great things." As she walked away, Elliot's heart swelled with gratitude. His relationships with his team had become so much more than professional. They were built on mutual respect, trust, and a shared commitment to growth. The promotion wasn't just a recognition of his hard work, it was a recognition of the work they had all done together. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, planning, and strategy sessions. Elliot threw himself into the new role, knowing it was more than just a title, it was a chance to continue to lead with integrity, to keep lifting others up, and to make the company a place where everyone could thrive. He found himself reflecting often on his journey, on the pivotal moments that had shaped him. From the first confrontation with Sophie Morgan to the quiet moments of growth, he had learned that true leadership wasn't about domination, it was about inspiration. It wasn't about the control you held over others, it was about the trust you built with them. And as Elliot stood before his team during his first full leadership meeting as head of operations, he realized that the greatest achievement wasn't the promotion, it was the journey that had led him to this point. A journey that was far from over, but one that had made him into the leader he had always aspired to be.